as usual, we just have gotten the gang together for our weekly coaches call we do every Thursday, and occasionally we are gonna turn the mics on and allow you to listen in on what we do internally as a company for our own personal continuing education. We, as a collective of coaches at CycleSmart, really benefit from sharing information with each other and working together as a team of coaches. And we know that out of those conversations, that if we're learning from each other, that there's a lot of insight in these conversations that would be useful for all of you. And we decided we should start sharing that with you. And so we have today Al Donahue, Austin Killips, Stephen Hyde, Jordan Villela, Mike Vandenham, and I'm Adam Meyerson. Again, thanks for joining us. This episode, today we're going to talk about periodization. We thought it was timely, even though it's almost March 1, but as usual, most of these conversations are timeless. You can listen to them again and again. They'll be useful this year and they'll be useful next year, and anytime that you listen to them. And yes, of course, people are talking about base and how their winter is going, and we're having those conversations with our athletes and ourselves as well. But what we really wanted to do was not just have a winter training podcast or a base training podcast, but talk about periodization and how periodization has changed since this company started. 25 years? 25 years. Bike racing for 35 years, but 25 years of Cycle Smart. So you can imagine that we've learned a lot since then. Information has changed and our approach has changed. So we're going to talk about how things used to be, why we've changed, how things are now, what's still useful from the past, what's worked for us personally, and also how we might go back and do things differently. If we could coach ourselves differently or approach our own racing careers differently than we did before. Um, so I guess to kick that off, we need a question. We need a first question to kick it off. And I think we want to talk about the average athlete. I think one of the things difficult about this podcast is there are so many different athletes and different athlete goals to periodize around. And we would have to do a different podcast almost for the different circumstances that each athlete might find them in. What a full-time professional might do is very different from what a winter-bound, time-limited, daylight-limited, weather-limited athlete with 8 hours a week to work with might do. We do want to talk about both of those things, but we also want to make this relatable. It's not always going to be useful for us to tell you to ride 35 hours a week in Tucson in the winter, right? There's only a few people that that's a useful conversation for. But we want to use all those examples. And I guess I'll start by saying, let's talk about what's traditional or what's historic, what people might be familiar with. And I think I would characterize that as period. Well, let me back up for a second. Should we define periodization for folks? We're making an assumption that people who are listening know what we mean by periodization, and maybe I shouldn't take that for granted.
Yes, I
So
believe we should definitely set a idea of what we mean by periodization.
yeah, and I apologize. This will be a review for some folks and maybe new for others, but um, in short, the idea here is that you would work on different aspects of your fitness at different parts of the season, potentially in an intentional sequential order or not, to build the best fitness possible for either performance over the course of a season, peaking for particular events, general improvement over time. And there are lots of approaches to periodization, and we'll talk about all of those today. But I guess that's the shortest definition I could give for it for these purposes. Traditionally, I would characterize the periods that I've relied on as an off season, a preseason, a first base phase, and followed by a second base phase that works on slightly different things. An intensity period where maybe volume goes down and intensity goes up and more work happens over threshold. And then maybe after a season of racing and recovering, or a period of racing and recovering, that might be a rebuild period for a second part of the season, and maybe peaking for particular events within there. And I put that in the pyramidal model, which we'll be specific about later. But um, for me, I started racing in the 80s. I tried to be a full-time bike racer in the 90s. For the information that was available at the time and the way things were done, with relying on heart rate monitors in the 90s and getting my first power meter in 2000, this was the system that I relied on. And I would say that model has some merit still with some caveats, but let's start by talking about um, maybe how that's changed, or what are the other ways that we are periodizing things for people, with the first question of when do we start? If we're planning an athlete season, they could be starting November 1 for the next season. They could be starting January 1 for the next season. They could be starting March 1. We have some athletes who are racing cyclocross until Christmas, or maybe not racing cyclocross at all. We have some athletes maybe who are racing cyclocross until Worlds, or not racing cyclocross at all. We have some athletes who are in warm weather who might start racing in January on the road, and others who are indoors until the time changes, and January, February, March is trainer time. So let me ask all of you, what's the start of your athlete's season when you are repeating the cycle based on the calendar year and weather seasons and competitive seasons? What's the starting point?
I'll
I,
start. I mean, I feel like it really depends on the athlete a lot of times. I mean, I have professional athletes, elite athletes, whom their season's not dictated by them. I mean, most of us here have been under the team program scenario where we kind of just have to show up regardless. I mean, I remember going down and doing Delray in March after racing till February, and then just being on a pure base program. Um, so like you said, we're working with a lot of athletes who do cross, and cross is such a intense period for these athletes, not just from the efforts themselves, but for just doing an entire season of racing throughout the winter. It's so intensive on them. We always have to work in a break period, and so for me, it always the 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 starting point is like, how long of a break does this athlete really need? Not like how long did we budget for, but like how long do we need? If they race till end of December, middle of December, and they have to race in March or even February, um, can they even show up prepared? Will they be smoked by April at that point if they don't take a good enough break? Um, but it seems to me that the athletes that are racing cross, even at the amateur level, through November, December, that getting started up on by January, by end of December is usually a pretty good time.
Mhm.
For sure. I think I see with a lot of people, if we're looking at our average person who races cross, that that break cycle corresponds nicely with Christmas, because we know it's hard to train during Christmas for a lot of people. But taking a bigger step back, kind of to what Stephen was saying, is this is where periodization does play a really good role. Is we can look at the entire year as a macro cycle, right? Looking at your year, you can't just go into the season and wing it. And that's where there's a lot of value to this traditional periodization model. Is it means you sit down with your coach, with your race calendar, and figure out either when do I want to race or when do I have to race or whatever that is, and actually start making a plan and be like, okay, this is where I can fit in some training blocks. This is where I can't. Maybe this is where I have to rest because there's not another opportunity. So again, to what Stephen was saying, it changes so much for every athlete depending on when their race calendar is, when their training availability is.
I
If
think
they
that's
have,
key.
yeah,
100% working with them, because like for me, I have people that are very ambitious, but I don't coach any professional athletes right now. So we work from the time their racing starts. So I have people, let's say, looking at Leadville, and so we have a bunch of time leading into that. Let's say if they stopped cyclocross, but then you have others that are, going to Valley of the Sun, or you had an athlete go to Valley of the Sun recently, Mike, that just finished cyclocross. So it depends when their season starts and when they want to be good for myself, and then we work up to that point, because maybe they can afford a longer off season, to kind of feel better, to let those injuries heal and things like that, and then ramp into the season. But rule of thumb, I would say that January, everybody likes to start something in the new year and start to figure like this is when it's time to start prepping to go again. I feel like that signals in our head, like let's go and let's start laying down base work, whether it's proper base, or it's just like, what you could call pre-base of like getting ready to get going again. I think that's when the time is.
I think for the athletes that don't race cross, the road season isn't as long as it used to be, or there are starting to be more like gravel events and other things to do in the late summer, early fall, but otherwise things kind of drop off for you in September. Um, and so I think for that type of athlete, you have time to take all of the recovery that you need.
I'm
And
envious of that. I get envious when I see those road athletes, my friends that are like, "What are you doing?" They're like mountain bike rides and hanging out, And I'm
yeah,
like, man,
well,
come on, I want to do that.
I've always utilized what I call like a fall base period. So it is if you're not racing in the fall, but your goals you don't start racing again till the following March, it frees you up to have while there's still nice weather and daylight, to actually get some of that less structured, less intense, enjoyable endurance training with a little bit of less structure, freedom to kind of do some of the fun things that you didn't get a chance to do. But I've always characterized that. I've periodized that as the fall base period, and I don't want to get us too ahead of ourselves, but I think we're kind of, if we're reaching a consensus here, whatever you're doing in the fall, whether you have a fall base period or a preseason or an off season, or you're racing cyclocross, we're gonna plan around a January 1 start to the period for the purposes of this conversation, and know as we go through it, we'll keep talking about the caveats to that. If you don't start, and if you go to Cross Worlds, when do you start? If you don't race cross at all, where do you start? Um, but if you're doing a fall base period and then you take the holidays off, you're right. I mean, I think it's just an organic place to start, because when we talk about how we periodize things, yeah, again, we're not just talking about racing seasons. We're talking about weather. We're talking about, for some people, when we're talking about calendar year.
I think it's also an important thing to kind of put up as a parameter of effective dosage, right? Like you can train too much, and it can be difficult for some of the riders who have a single season and they live in perpetually good weather to ride some of the fitness out of their legs and not have the fitness, the motivation, throughout those years. So this is where, periodization in the kind of most pure form is just like, how do we make the most use out of this time, without doing too much work? Because
Yeah,
that's
Al
a
Al has
problem.
said that to me before. He's like, you got to watch the stoke.
Yeah.
You can't have too much stoke, because like myself and athletes that I coach, the January 1 goes, you have the New Year's goals, you have all this stuff, and people are like, I'm ready to do 15-hour weeks off the couch, and like, no, that seems like a bad idea. And even as myself, when I think it, you aren't impervious to this as a coach. You think, I've taken a pretty long hockey break, time to get back on and start, riding bikes again. And you can't do that. And periodization and building in a specific way helps that.
I
And
think I think
limiting.
where that shows up, we talked about Valley of the Sun. I think it's a good model right now because um, I have a whole team of juniors who have to go to Valley of the Sun now because it's a junior national team selection race. So juniors all over the country are starting their season in the middle of February in Arizona. And we know that if you've been on the trainer in New England, even if you raced across, you've basically had 8 weeks on the trainer mostly before you head off to Valley of the Sun, and you're racing against riders who are in Southern California or in Arizona who have been racing since January 1, real races. And so I think we can talk about how periodization clashes, or if you are in a warm place like Arizona, and you have racing that started January 1, like that shifts your whole periodization up forward. And then when does the bottom, as you mentioned, when does the bottom come out of that? But
Mm-hmm.
so let me take that to no matter where you are, when you kick it off, and again, keeping in mind the model athlete who maybe has 8 to 12 or 8 to 14 hours or even 16 if you're pushing it, but let's say 8 to 12 hours a
That's max
week.
though. That's
Yeah,
max
yeah,
though.
to
Yeah.
work with, right? Um, what does it mean when you're kicking it off? What is that first base block? Starting from an off season, starting from a rest, starting from scratch. What does that look like for your athletes?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think we've hit on this a bunch of times. But for my athletes, uh, it's both dictated by what they're physically capable of, but also what they're seasonally capable of, and maybe mentally capable of as well in that block. So you kind of have all those things coming together. Like I have a lot of people who are primarily riding the trainer, so naturally we end up doing a little bit less volume than if you were in Tucson or Southern California or something like that. Um, and then I also have a lot of people where they aren't seeing the sun a lot. Like I live in a pretty gray, cloudy climate, so even if it's at the loss of a trainer ride, I do push people to get outside in the winter just for their own mental well-being and longevity in the season. So what does that look like? It looks like a lot of lower zone 2, sometimes pushing a little bit more rides, probably a workout that's above threshold in there per week, but we're not focused on building volume like you would maybe see some of these, like you'd see pros riding in Spain or Tucson or whatever, which just it's not possible for everyone
That's
that I
tough.
coach.
That's tough to witness that as a onlooker, to see everybody putting in these large volume weeks, and even your friends on Strava. That's a tough one that I have to speak with athletes, and they want to do these giant weeks, and a slow rollout is kind of the best
It's
way in
for
my
sure.
Well,
It's
opinion.
hard for
that
me as
really
an
brings up a
athlete.
key part of the evolution of understanding of periodization is that, we used to think of zones as discrete, non-overlapping energy systems. And I think that progression has radically changed in that like base can look like a lot of different things, understanding how kind of lactate mechanics works and why intensity is critical for building aerobic function. So I think that helps the trainer set too, and also informs like the pure volume people. So the conversation around periodization is very different than it was 20 years ago, because that was like you worked on one thing at a time, which is not really the way to go or the way the body works.
It was like LSD, right? Just long, slow
Right,
distance
right.
Yeah,
forever.
don't get into the little ring.
Let me
Yeah.
ask you, and maybe Austin too, because I think Austin has athletes that are limited by weather and daylight as well. But for your athletes who are limited, what I think you hit on here is we have this traditional idea of base period being big hours, but that is in conflict with most people's reality, which is limited time based on daylight and weather in January and February where you might have done those big hours. So what does
My
that look
so my
like?
base building is based on limitation. So I will assess limitations through types of testing that show me their glycolytic and aerobic function, and I work on those limitations based on the person I'm looking at and their event demands. So that's what determines a periodization model for me.
I like to think about the trainer that way as well, because I think there's lots of reasons why we can think, oh, it sucks that you're riding the trainer all winter. But like Al sort of pointed out there, it actually allows you to do work in a specific way that is really challenging to do outdoors. So again, I would rather be riding outdoors. I think we'd all rather be riding outdoors. But there are some perks to being indoors. Like Al said, you can, if you have realized that your VLA is incredibly low, you can do very specific work on the trainer to address
And
that.
tracking progress as a coach is much easier when athletes on a trainer just because it's so consistent. You can look at power to heart rate over duration of different intensities, and like you get so much cleaner data there.
Yeah, the environment doesn't change typically. They've
Right, and
controlled
the dosage can be a lot smaller to elicit the same response. But you have to know what you're working on.
So everybody just ride the trainer, stop going outdoors. That's what we're saying here.
It'll get you fit.
Just take your vitamin D.
I want to put this to Austin. So like if you are, let's say, removing volume as one of your tools for building base, and for whatever reason, because you don't need it, because you don't think it's effective, but let's remove that from the equation as a distraction. Let's remove that distraction. And I think your athletes are mostly on the trainer in January and February as well. So what are you addressing for them in this January, February, and maybe March period in the window that they have before their first events, which most likely aren't going to come until April, but maybe some people are racing in March?
Yeah, I mean, March is when Mid-South happens, and being from the Midwest, a lot of folks, that's like a big event that a lot of folks target. So, but yeah, I mean, the weather is wretched in Chicago. The weather's not great in anywhere, like in the Pacific Northwest. So yeah, I think focusing on like embracing the fact that there are limitations to how much volume we can get in is a big part of it. And a lot of people, I mean, I think one of the biggest advancements in training for the last, I mean, it was normalized once I came into the sport, but is the trainer. The trainer is normalized. People like the trainer, people ride the trainer. It's like a thing that has been embraced. So, I mean, I have athletes that are really happy to get on the trainer for 8 hours, 12 hours a week. And yeah, we're targeting work that's sustainable, and we're targeting work that's not just working like tempo and endurance. It's a lot more intensity in the mix.
Mm-hmm.
So Al outlined his goals as identifying limiters or shortcomings in the athlete and using the base period to address those. And sometimes if I'm trying to be metaphorical about that, I think about equalizers, right? We're trying to move up and down sliders based on the performance profile that we're looking for an athlete at a certain time, and you identify what is low. But sometimes you need to push something down to push something up, which can happen in the base period too, though I think often in the base period where we are sometimes looking for general overall improvement, and maybe you touch a little bit of everything to get started and to see where an athlete is at. I think the next question I'll put to all of you from there is like, I think about hitting the benchmarks of the targeted event as well as the context of the athlete. So almost like deconstructing the events that an athlete is training for. Like one of the biggest challenges is these very long gravel races that happen early in the season. Like you essentially can't train for Mid-South. Most people can't train for it properly because you're on limited time and you're training for what is essentially an ultra endurance event for most people. So that's a challenge, right? Those two things are, you don't have all the time that you need.
The challenge there is making that an A event, which if you don't have the time to train for it, it shouldn't be an A event. So that's the biggest problem I see with athletes is over prioritizing events they can't prepare for.
Yeah. And it's funny that you say that.
Great point. Yeah.
That's such a huge part of your macro cycle and season planning, and by extension, kind of the periods of the season is not just setting goals, but setting goals that actually make sense.
Could we talk about what an A event is?
Well, not yes, but not yet.
Oh, okay. Oh, I've skipped ahead on the syllabus. Yeah.
Chill. We have an outline. Follow that.
Manage the Stoke, Jordan. Manage the Stoke.
I was just
Well,
thinking too.
and so I think we all understand. So I mean, there's an offshoot here where how do we help athletes set realistic goals, and when do you say no to your athlete because you're trying to be a good coach? Like, yes, it's great that you're interested in that, but that's not realistic, and we can do the best that we can. But these are the reasonable expectations you should have around an event like that in March. I think that's a
Mhm.
tricky and important. You want to make your athletes happy, but you have to be honest with them, and sometimes that means telling them things that they
Well,
don't want to hear.
but sometimes that like I don't always like to use myself as an example. We can go a little anecdotal here. Is I I I'm racing Mid South in a few weeks, and I was also in Europe for 7 weeks in December and January. So managing
Not
that,
training, you
not
were in
training.
Europe
That's right.
working. Yeah, let's be
I
clear
was
about what
not
you were
training.
doing. Yeah,
I was riding 6 hours a week,
yeah,
maybe.
you were
Um,
working.
and so that was coming with a lot of stress and pressure about like, okay, well, I have to be ready for this event. But once I accepted that that wasn't going to be an A event and it was on the path to target events that were in June, which I could actually prepare for, the stress around that, it wasn't that I was going to do anything different in my training. It just took so much of that pressure off. And instead of seeing it as this like sort of sense of impending doom, watching everyone else train 25 hours a week, it was like, no, you go there, you prepare for it, you do the best you can, but it's a step on a path to something bigger, to your actual objective. And that framing that really helped me, and I think helps a lot of people.
And I think it's easy to get, over eager about the events when you've spent an entire season on the trainer. You're like, oh my God, I get to go somewhere warm. It's going to be 55 degrees. And you just have to be like, it's okay for it not to be a race that you're targeting to win, but the beginning of the season and a
Yeah.
pleasant experience.
Participation
You
oriented.
can have goals. You can have
Yeah.
goals for goals that for events that aren't A events. Maybe it's to like work on your fueling strategy or pace it properly or test different equipment or whatever it is. Like there's things you can do there, even if the goal is not to have your peak performance.
So the thing what I think about my goals in the base period for myself and my athletes is hitting benchmarks that are oriented around the events that I'm trying to train for. Generally, maybe not specifically, but generally about duration, um, time and zone, like how intense is the event, how many minutes. If I can deconstruct the event, how many minutes at threshold need to be completable, like what do you have to have for like a time to exhaustion to be able to compete in that event, and then what kind of power do you have to make in that event, and trying to build those things. And so what I would add to that is the important point that Al made about what are your individual strengths and weaknesses that need to be adjusted. Are you a low VLA max athlete versus a high VLA max athlete? Do you need to raise that or lower that? I think is one of the levers where we talk about pulling on a lot. So how do we then to try to get us to the next part of the conversation? I think what we've been talking about here when we talk about the base period is we're talking about the period between when you've rested from the season before and before the beginning of your racing season. And why are we discussing it in that way? Because once the racing season starts, this goes back to what Stephen was saying about you have to be somewhere at a certain time. Of course, we have control. We're not all professional athletes who are having our calendar dictated to us, but there is a seasonal racing calendar that's based on weather and daylight. In New England, there's training races that start in March, but the real races don't start until April. So if you've got January, if you're a New England rider with limited time, daylight savings time changes in mid-March, you've got 2 to 3 months after the cyclocross season or after your holiday break, whatever it looks like, to prepare yourself for a racing season that, let's say, starts April 1. And once the racing season starts, your ability to control your training is diminished because you are replacing training opportunities with race days. And this is why I'm discouraging my local athletes from doing our local training race in March, because they're finally able to ride outside. They're finally able to add some duration and actually like wiggle their butts on a bike outside rather than being on the trainer. And I don't want them to miss out on that. for a race that maybe isn't important or doesn't mesh with our training goals. So
I just had this conversation with my athletes too, because there's something that creeps into your mind when you know a race is coming up and you start, skimping on the weight training, skimping on a few other things, and the goals are later on down the year. And
yeah,
it's hard
well,
to put those so early in the season.
you want to be prepared for the events when they start, even if you aren't peaking for them. You want to be fit enough to participate in them so that they add to your fitness rather than detract from it. Often racing is a withdrawal. It's time in the car, it's travel. It's an event at an intensity you have no control over that could be too easy or too hard. Or, of course, there's skills to be gained from racing, and I believe in racing for training for that reason. We talk a lot about the dearth of craft and skill in bike racing right now, and I don't want to discount that, but I think there's time to do that in April. You don't have to jump into training races in March unless they happen to fit your schedule. And I guess I didn't mean to go on for so long about this, but let's say your local training race starts and it's on Saturdays, and Saturday was your threshold day, and you can ride to the race. Like you don't have to spend the day in the car, but you can ride there and do a 1 hour local training criterium on a Saturday in March and ride home. So you can accomplish, you didn't waste your day in the car. You got some variable power threshold. You got to practice being in a, like that might be worth doing. That's a scenario where it might be worth jumping into that race. But then what? So where I want us to go next is it's April 1 or whatever it is. But now we're at the start of the racing season. And so where are we? How do the phases change? What are our goals for this next period where I wouldn't expect people to be peaking, but I would expect them to be ready to start competing and looking ahead towards a thing they were peaking for. And for most people, I mean, let's use like junior nationals or masters nationals as a window where someone might be trying to be at their best for. And that's the end of June, beginning of July, which is enough time for anyone, no matter where they live, to prepare and peak. There's a sufficient window of preparation if you're trying to be ready for something like that. A Memorial Day weekend is pro and 17, 18, under 23 nationals in the US, and also a huge weekend of racing all over the country. So that's, let's say June, you're trying to be like at your best for June. So where are we, coaches, on April 1?
Yeah, good question. I think for a lot of my athletes, especially again the weather limited ones, end of March, beginning of April is where you actually can start adding volume into the training program in a way that you maybe weren't able to in February and the beginning of March. The weekends are nicer. There's a chance to get out for 3-4 hours on weekend days for even people who are pretty busy. They can probably get outside after work at least some of the time if you live in, daylight savings time has happened. So as opposed to trying to do a lot of volume in January, February, I start introducing a lot more volume in end of March, beginning of April as you build towards those target events. So yeah, I guess in some ways that would start to resemble it, just in terms of the volume demands, a more traditional base build. However, we are still, with the benefit of all the testing we're doing now and inside testing, you're still very much addressing weaknesses during that period as well, just with more volume than you were before.
Yeah, and I always look for again, back to what are the kind of goals for the season? What kind of markers are we trying to move? You obviously have that time where you need to perform to some degree, and we always have a mix of here is the type of work that is going to mimic and get you to be a part of this race, to have good performance. We have this background thing going on that we're still trying to make a move, are we still trying to move VLA up or down, which becomes really, really difficult in the race season, especially when there's a ton of crits. You want to pull somebody's VLA down in crit season, it's hard. Without, a lot of work that's going to make them nice and flat. So, yeah, it still becomes critical to have these little phases of training in there, not just letting it go for racing fitness only and just saying all right, go ham on the racing. You still have to have these little micro periods where you're like, all right, we got to bring on a certain amount of fatigue to move these markers for yourself.
Let me jump in here for a second, and for the listeners who might have heard us talk about VLA max a few times in conversation here and we haven't explained it. I don't want to, we've talked about it on previous podcasts. If you want to read up on that, I'd probably send you to inside.com, inscyd.com, to read up on VLA max there. Brief definition. Al, you want to give us your shortest VLA max definition for the listeners?
It's the peak rate of glycolytic power production, which corresponds to peak lactate production.
And so if we were going to describe it anecdotally, would we say it's your ability to make big efforts repeatedly?
Mm-hmm. It's what people used to call anaerobic power, which is a misnomer and kind of fundamentally misunderstands how the human body uses lactate and recycles carbohydrate through the whole process of, power at a given rate, a high rate of production.
I think in the 90s we called it crit legs, right? We talked about having great crit legs, and what we meant by that was if we had to go out and do a steady state 40K time trial that took an hour, we'd get absolutely destroyed, and the ability to make high sustainable steady state threshold power was missing, and you had this sense that your form had fallen out through the floor. But then get in a 1 hour criterium where you had to sprint and coast every 15 seconds for an hour, and you could do that all day long and feel fabulous doing it. We didn't quite understand the mechanism for that then, even though we did eventually understand.
Still don't.
Yeah, right. Well,
and so with VLA, that's a production and a flux rate, but also your ability to move and reuse lactate is something that changes quite a bit with fitness. And the rate at which you stop reusing lactate is also a critical thing that I look at or try to look at with athletes' profiles.
So for the listeners, so when you hear us talking about VLA max, this is a big part of our approach these days. And there's not often new things that move the needle for us, and this is one of those things. So if you want to, you can listen to previous podcasts, the testing podcast in particular, to learn more about that. But one of the testing protocols we use is from Inside, and you can go to inside.com and read up on VLA max, or just Google it, and that's probably where it'll take you. I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that because it might go straight by people that might be their first time hearing about that. Yeah, I think to pick up where Stephen left off, again, what we keep bumping up against, and actually Mike mentioned this as well, is what we might want to do for training based on our races and when they happen are limited by weather and daylight and environment. We don't always have the time and weather and daylight to do the training that we want to, and sometimes periodization is based on doing what you can when you can. And this is where Al's preferred approach that Al, would you characterize your approach as more I don't feel like you refer to your approach as polarized exactly, because you're not using
those terms don't have, I don't think they have any meaning, and they're not like, it's just kind of clickbait at this point, because there's no like, once you start breaking down how people execute intensity, there's less difference that is reported. And there's no like, no one should, like, if a coach is one or the other, they're not a good coach.
Yeah, so that's why I wanted to clarify, because I would define your approach, and I want you to be able to define it, but I'm trying to paraphrase for you and summarize.
I'd say integrated, where so as opposed to looking at like, periodization was like work on one thing at a time, how we make power and how we train is interconnected on every level, and that needs to be part of the conversation. And also like the time frame, like big chunks don't necessarily make sense. I would say periodization should be moving to more distributed, because I don't need to work on something for 8 weeks anymore. Like that didn't do what we thought it was doing. You can use smaller periods, and also, so I'd say that's a big change, as well as like you should be working on multiple things at once because they work synergistically.
Yeah, right. Okay, so perfect. This is heading us somewhere I want to go.
Another key point is there are enough people that don't respond to volume, and that's critical as a coach to identify if an athlete is a responder or not.
Yeah.
I think just trying to like fit everybody into that same type of paradigm is like, if you actually look at the data, they'll do a bunch of volume and are no better because you missed that kind of what aspect was the greatest limiter for them. And until you improve that, like the volume isn't helpful until you remove that limiter first.
Yeah, and I think that can be really hard based off of like past experiences. I mean, coming from like an athlete to coach, this was one of the hardest things for me to let go of because, like, you know, I could go do back to back 30-hour weeks for some time.
Right. And that's like for you, it's transformative. Like for some athletes, like, especially if you're a high achieving pro, like it is transformative. For other people, it's like, it's transformative in the other direction.
And that's why we have to be
Yeah.
careful about copying what the pros do. And so, Stephen, you were racing as well as I was, 10 months a year. There were only
Yeah,
at most. And when you went to Worlds, maybe even more than that. Maybe you were racing 11 months a year. But
pretty much racing 11 months a year for most of the time.
if for me as a pro, when Cross Nationals was in December, it meant that I had the last 2 weeks of December for an off season, and I had January and February to train, and March 1 was training camp, and we started racing. So for those 2 months, you do have to take advantage. It was one of the few windows that you had to work on that volume and aerobic fitness and the changes that you could get from that, because you couldn't really do it at any other time of the year. That's not a model to emulate for the average athlete. And also the sport has changed. So maybe I can take us here from the start of the season into this integrated approach that Al is talking about, where, I describe it as moving the sliders on an equalizer. We race less often. That's one thing that's changed. There's more time to train between races than there was in previous decades. People aren't racing 60 or 80 times in a season. They might be racing, if you race 20 summer events, road, gravel, mountain bike, and 20 cyclocross races, that's a huge amount of racing these days. That would have been half of what we did when we were all full-time bike racers. There were seasons where I definitely did 80 events, where I did 40 cross races and 80 road races. That was not unusual. Now we race less and we train more between races, and I think we also see that as a model at the professional level. Even the pros who can do that volume are racing less and doing more preparation between events. And I think so. This is why I think for the average athlete, when we talk about that integrated approach, where you're working on the weaknesses, and I don't mean your like genetic weaknesses, so that can be part of it. It just can be the thing that you need to train, improve, even if you're good at it, to get ready for the events that are upcoming. And so, coaches, what does that look like once the racing season starts? And how does it change from when you had weekends free to train, and now weekends consist of at least one event of some type?
Yeah, I think that, well, this is where, it has to be really fluid, right? And I think letting go of the kind of, we've talked about this before, of like letting go of the kind of dogma of like it has to be like this. Things have to fit this mold. Sometimes you have like 4 days to get to get training in between, 10 race days all put together with stage racing, etc. So you really have to kind of learn to first target recovery in a really well thought out way. It can't just be kind of a second thought on that. Without the recovery, you don't get the training, period, and you really don't get the benefit of the racing. So thinking about piggybacking off of the racing, like what response did you get from that? How can we utilize that? How can we stimulate you aerobically based off of like all that heavy lactate work you just did for 1 day or multiple days on end? So looking at pairing race days with training days, I think has always been a plus for me. Like I understand, yeah, you had 2 really hard race days where you just got pounded. Great time to do a 3 or 4 hour ride the day afterwards, instead of taking it off like you really wanted to.
Yeah, I agree. I like that. I think in the news it's Pidcock often or Vanderpool like riding home from things or after races, and I think the average athlete maybe can't do the Monday endurance ride. That doesn't, everybody's got to go back to work on Monday. But I'll give you an example. Like I have Xander Skopinic-Bergel in Spain right now, and the schedule over there is just one Saturday race of like 120, 130K. And that's going to work out great for us because we can train during the week and rest and race. But I have him doing a straight endurance day on Sunday. We're going to capitalize on the fatigue from that event and still get some training in at a lower intensity on that second day with, sort of what's left in the tank and see what kind of improvements we can get as a result of that and not waste the day, basically.
Yeah, and depending on what kind of changes you want to make in that athlete, I mean, go back to VLA, like you might have them do some heavier work. Like it might be some sweet spot on top of that, even though it was a heavy race day.
Yeah.
If you want to pull VLA down or something like that.
Let me take that and lead it into some like individual questions. We've got sort of a list of sort of like various questions here or individual things that tie into everything that we're talking about. And this is what's tricky about this podcast. It can be very, very specific or very, very vague. And maybe we can give some specific answers here about like what does it mean? All this conversation we've had so far, what does it actually mean in terms of the workouts that we're doing? So if we're talking about VLA and we're in the season right now, we have two considerations. What type of event is the athlete targeting, and does it require an increase in VLA max for performance? So if it's someone racing criteriums, then we know we want them to have a high VLA max. If it's someone racing gravel, we know we want them to have a low VLA max. Then we have the added component of do they have a naturally high VLA max? If you test them off the couch, is VLA max high or low? So what do we know about that athlete in terms of the training that they need to do? How do we address that in an in-season period? We'll call this phase race recover, or in season, where you're racing on the weekends, but you're moving towards your target event, and we've identified that VLA either has to go up or down, and you as an athlete, your athlete is inclined to a high or low VLA max. What are the workouts? Turned out to be a bigger question than I meant for it to be, but let's see if we can riff on that for a little bit.
So moving VLA tends to be the negative, is like the thing that really pushes it up or brings it down. The negative is that's what really drives it the most, as opposed to adding more of something that pushes it in the direction you want. Like the things that you're doing that are counteracting the movement, that tends to have the biggest effect for my athletes.
Yeah. So can you go into deeper detail and give us? I know what you mean because we've had this conversation lots of times, but give me an example.
If we need to move up, I think what I see most is it's often fueling. So nutrition has a major impact on VLA. So low glycogen availability and that kind of like 2 millimole, or so kind of like high zone 2 tempo. Those are like, that person who like doesn't like to eat often loves to ride in tempo. So they have all these behaviors that are pulling against the direction we want to go. And so really like getting away from that and making sure we're adding like eat a lot more carbohydrate on your ride and keep the kind of demands of type 2 fibers as low as possible, so they're not getting any stimulus to move in the opposite direction we're looking to move.
So if you want VLA max to go up, stay away from tempo work and make sure you're fueling your workouts. Is that the practical way experience?
And like complete, like make sure we're getting very complete rest between difficult sessions.
Yeah, rest being the real key there. I mean, staying away from that like middle intensity stuff and complete rest in those periods. I mean, that's what I mean by those little blocks have to be strategically placed off of rest especially if you want to move VLA up.
I've
have
been
to.
talking a lot. Like we end up with power targets based around the testing that we do. But I also like to talk a lot to my athletes about how did it feel? Sharp, heavy, like what are we looking at here? Because that also has some insight into which direction you're moving your VLA. If every workout you do is feeling heavy, right? You're probably moving it down. If you're doing efforts, they can be hard. Sharp can still be hard, but if they feel sharp, snappy, then we're doing things that are maybe, like Al said, maybe it's not moving it up, but that's the right type of work to be
It's called
doing.
VLA
And
max
if you avoid the
positive,
rest,
right? Yeah, we often
exactly.
in our
That's a
conversations
good
we
point.
say, is it VLA max positive or negative? And so I think if you're a crit racer in the middle of the summer, it's a lot of racing and recovering, and there isn't a lot of training. It's racing and being fresh for those races and going hard in those races, and the races themselves are sprint coast, sprint coast, sprint coast, and then you want to fully recover from that and keep the legs fresh, and that's where VLA max goes up. There's a trade-off for that, right? And you've got to put the foundation back in at some point. There's got to be a rebuild period, or you won't make it to the end of the season if all you're doing is racing and recovering, right? There is a withdrawal on work capacity that happens from that.
I love that analogy too of thinking of it. I think maybe you explained this to me. It was like it was a bank account, and you're putting money in, and then when you're going to race days and doing these longer efforts, it's just pulling money out, and pretty soon you'll be broke. You won't be able to do that anymore. So I
Yeah,
think that's a great way to look at it.
yeah. Investments and withdrawals. There's got to be
Hay in the barn. I
the
like the hay
withdraw.
in the barn
Yeah,
analogy too.
the withdrawals are the performance, and you're going to make a withdrawal to have some performance. You're going to go spend your money.
Yeah.
You got to put some back in before the season's over. What about strength training? And I guess it's good to talk about it here because we know that strength training can have a positive effect on VLA max as well. But strength training is also a thing that maybe we focus on in that early season before racing happens. So I'd like to hear like how are we relying on strength training in that preseason that we are calling base. I shouldn't use preseason because that's its own period, but the base period before racing starts. And are you
I use
continuing with strength training once racing starts?
100%.
Yeah, it depends on, for me, what style of racing the athlete is doing. But mostly, if you're in that race and recover period, there's a maintenance phase that you should be in. At least, you should be doing your range of motion and mobility days, things that like core and, keeping track of your biofeedback as far as your movement goes. But then also a maintenance day where you're in the gym doing low reps and just kind of hitting those energy systems, or at least those strength systems.
Now, all that said, I do find that I get the most what would you call it, like compliance for strength workouts, like getting athletes to do strength workouts in the winter, because I've said this before, it's always sunny in the gym, right? You can go to
Oh
the
yeah.
gym no matter what the weather is outside. So I find it is easier, and you also have the time available because people are training less volume when the weather sucks outside, to get them to do more gym days, or maybe just spend more time doing more specific stuff. And then I have found that as you get into the season where people are able to ride a lot more, we're still doing gym days, but like you were saying, it's maybe a little bit more maintenance. Maybe it's more functional mobility, a check-in day in the gym, but not those 2 or even 3 days where you're going and lifting heavier things. And
Yeah.
again, what you're lifting is dependent on what you're trying to do in
And
the
they
season.
should feel energy, rejuvenated after the gym. I think Al, you said that to me before. Like you should feel like you could put your best sprint power out. Like not something where you go in and the next day it's like DOMs or
Oh yeah,
you're
no.
feeling super bogged
I think
down.
there's
Like,
even
you
a
should feel
function where
like
you use it at the gym is recovery. So you should be able to lift at a level where it aids in recovery. You
Yeah,
can you'll come in
especially, like,
after like a hard
stamina-wise.
weekend and be very beat up, but then do a moderate set of lifts and feel fantastic after.
Oh, I always feel like
Stretching with
if
weights almost. Could
Yeah,
you call
yeah,
it
do a good
stretching?
one. Yeah.
Weighted
Yeah.
stretching. Yeah.
Right, but it has a lot of impact on hormone function and your central nervous system. So resetting the nervous system through lifting is a key component that's left on the table if we're not lifting all year round. And I want people to recover faster and stay more functional. So I would never stop going to the gym if you want to be your best.
I think a thing that we bump into that I struggle with, or a problem I'm trying to solve all the time, is that we only have 7 days in a week, right? And we have to prioritize the workouts that we want. And we may have a list of things that we want to work on, but we only have 7 days in the week to work on them. So, let's say racing has started, or if racing hasn't started, it's easier before racing has started to fit maybe all the things in that you want. And once racing has started, we're dedicating some of that time to racing, which means we have to dedicate a certain amount of time to recovery.
So hang on that one, I'd say like a lot of people have very unoptimized utilization of time, and they're like probably 2 or 3 hours in a week. I'm like, what did you do here, and what were we moving forward on? And those hours I would take in the gym because I know what the gym is doing, and it's a massive effect that we're not getting the use out of.
I think a big change I've made for a lot of athletes is basically it through the course of coaching is basically trading in the recovery ride for mobility gym. Is realizing that recovery ride, if we were doing it on Monday or whatever day, we were getting way less out of that than a gym session. The only time you were getting something out of that was because it was something enjoyable and you had the extra time. It was like it was a coffee ride to hang out with your friends.
Yeah.
But if we're tight on time, do something else.
Yeah.
Nice commute to work followed by mobility or gym work is like a great Monday.
Yeah.
You can also just ride super easy to the gym and do a light lift that's in the recovery domain, and then ride home, and that's much better than the cafe spin.
For sure.
What happens
And now
on the cafe spin is it turns into a cafe show-off contest, and then then it's
it's also
not
just time, like Al's talking about. Like,
a lot of us are
it's
parents
fun,
now
yeah.
too. Like I think a lot of people would rather spend that time, at the pump track with their kid than doing a recovery ride. At least I'm in that category. So like let's manage our time a little bit better, use it for different things, figure out what isn't moving the needle. And that's been a big thing, I think, that I try to focus on is what moves the needle, and then what is wasted time on the bike that you could be spent with your family, doing gym work, meal prepping, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I've found that some of my time has been spent kind of redirecting what athletes are wanting to do in the gym, or what we end up doing in the gym based off of their needs. Like, what are we going for here? Do you need to be in there lifting super heavy things for long periods of time? A lot of athletes probably not. I have some that really want to spend a lot of time in the gym and they're gung-ho on it. And that's great. I love the enthusiasm. However, some of them don't need to be under the squat rack 3 days a week.
It's addicting, that stuff too, and it's fun. You're there, you're hanging out, you're listening to music, it's warm,
Right. But I don't know anybody that doesn't need a stronger core, that doesn't need to work on their hips, period.
Yeah. Doing the right things at the right time for most people. That's the hardest part.
Let me ask you guys this individual question. And again, this is skipping around a little bit and maybe was more applicable to the base phase before racing has started, but how are you utilizing virtual platforms like Zwift or Training Peaks Virtual in this? I think in particular in this season before racing starts. We know that kind of goes out the window once the weather gets good and days get longer and there's bike racing to do. But how are you either encouraging people to use virtual platforms, or I think this is often the case for us these days, restricting them, reining them in? How are you limiting what they're doing on virtual platforms to get their training goals accomplished?
Mm-hmm. I think when you're talking about restricting, you're really talking about the availability of racing every single day.
Yes.
30 days a month.
Right.
The addiction of racing. It's like the best 3-minute power you put out that week is that beginning of that 30-minute Zwift race where
Yeah.
they might be bots or whatever, you know,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
and it's so hard to explain to people. I have an athlete that's he gets tied in with these, you know, and it's really tough to say, like, it just, could we not get so competitive with it, you know,
Right.
because once you flip
So
that switch to racing, people go hard.
I yeah,
Go ahead,
I
Mike. Yeah.
let people race,
I do too.
but in the confines of where it makes sense, right?
And
It's
even then
not
they
all
do
the
more than
time.
they're supposed to, like with the caveat. Like Al has made the point on our calls many times that like if I have an athlete, I'll just give a very broad example, who's got like 2x20 threshold to do, right, which is such a common workout for so many people. There's plenty of 20-minute Zwift races, right? And sometimes you can go on Zwift and go, oh, there's a 20-minute race here and a 20-minute race here, and there's a certain amount of recovery in between. I trust myself to use those races to do my threshold, to not start hard, to not sprint at the end, to almost use it as a group interval workout. I don't really trust my athletes to do that. I do give them the flexibility for I'm gonna allow a certain amount of overpacing or overtraining in exchange for some stoke, right? So we talked about stoke. And so allowing some swap of threshold work for Zwift racing, I will incorporate some of that, knowing that I'm getting something, but it's costing me something with that athlete. What I really find most effective is the pace partners. There's almost always a pace partner riding at the intensity that you need to ride at. And that can help you get through your intervals on the trainer in a slightly more variable way that has a social aspect. It's also easier. Like, you're engaged. I find that you're engaged without being forced to sprint at the line, sprint at the start or at the finish, like you have to in most virtual races. Are you
It's
all
like
doing the same?
yes. Yeah, like anything, set yourself up to be successful. If you are trying to do an endurance ride and you drop into a Tour de Zwift event, like, are you really going to do that endurance ride? But if you try to do endurance ride and you sign up to go ride with a pace partner at your endurance pace, you're probably going to do that endurance ride.
That's
Like,
right.
set yourself up for success. Don't set yourself up to be tempted into not doing what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. And I think traditionally we've utilized Zwift for that, but I think we're seeing that Training Peaks Virtual is a good it's sufficient, right?
They've got a good range of pace partners that are, you just click on whoever you want and it gives you their power range that they'll be. And that's moderately entertaining, but it's like, because it's just that kind of like bot, there are some like longer group events that we'll do, or we'll actually set it up as like a team ride. So like, if humans are riding, that seems to be a lot more motivational for our crew.
And there's enough people on Training Peaks Virtual now to make it, like, there's a critical mass of folks on it to make it effective. And if you aren't paying for Zwift year round, but you are paying for a premium account on Training Peaks, which the majority of our athletes are, that is becoming an increasingly good option for folks, I think, is what we're observing.
And the structured workouts are motivational for most of my crew too, because they love to see the little compliance bar change colors. You get gold stars and neat colors. So
People love that.
But
Hey, I
I do
love
actually
it.
think there's a couple things. That can be motivational, but I have also found that I have some people, myself included, who, if you're doing a workout on Zwift, I would rather do it like I do a workout outside, which is ride to a climb.
That's what I do as well.
Do the workout on the climb, do a
Same
U-turn, and ride to the bottom and repeat it. Like, I find that more motivational than doing a workout compliance. So again, it's just like understanding yourself and understanding, and us working to understand our athletes and what works for them, because we're all different, right?
Yeah, but I also and that's my biggest challenge from using Training Peaks versus Zwift right now is on Zwift I have my spots. I know what hill I can ride to do my interval, and I can make those recommendations for athletes. And so I have some time invested there, and it's going to take a little while to learn the roads at Training Peaks Virtual. I don't know the
Which
roads
sounds
yet.
so ridiculous
I
to
know,
say, but yes.
Right. If I was starting from scratch right now, that's probably where I would start. Okay, let me ask. I think we've covered a lot, and I think we can move to wrapping things up. And what I want to do is give each one of you a moment to think about. It might be hard to do, but when you're thinking about periodization, there's probably 100 things that you might want to say as an important last point, but can we try and get one thing to remember from each of you to leave the listeners with regarding periodization? And I'm going to go in the order of how people are on my screen. So I'm going to start with you, Al.
Yeah, so periods and fitness in general are more interconnected than we used to believe. So I think like you need to take that information where like you don't have to be stuck in one aspect and you can distribute it more throughout the season than once thought.
Perfect. Austin, you're next.
I mean, I think something that's really exciting, especially about like what I've learned from Al and from everyone here, is like there's been all these models, like the sweet spot based model, which is like how can we just take the way professionals train and shrink it down a percentage? And I think rethinking the periodization and the ways that we are allows you to actually tailor programming to people's needs and to people's fitness, as opposed to just shrinking like volume and time. And as a percentage of what a pro would do or what have you.
Yeah, that's great. Super important. I think that is a common mistake and something that I feel like, Al, when you first came over to CycleSmart 20 years ago, was a thing that we talked about all the time, not just pro coaches who had their athletes doing percentages of what worked from them. And that wasn't the way. Stephen?
I'd say, throughout the planning, be flexible to what is really going to work for you. I mean, throughout the season, you have all these opportunities to pick and choose races that you want to do well at, that you want to perform at. And it's really important to spread that out and make sure that you have time that makes sense for you to train adequately for that and make sure that the goals align with that.
Jordan?
I'm a big fan of the bird's eye view and then kind of zooming in on each facet of the season and respecting the period that you're in. And so sometimes I have athletes that they want to rush to get from one to the next to the other, to the other. And I'm really into respecting the period that you're in and doing as well as you can in that, and then moving on to the next one and not worrying so much about what everybody else is doing, but like Stephen said, making it your own and being able to go with the ebb and flow of life, whether you get sick, whether kids, appointments pop up or things like that, making the best out of that period that you have.
Yeah. Mike?
Yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about season planning, but I think Stephen and Jordan hit on that perfectly. So I think what I would like people to take away from this is planning your season. Periodization is also about managing your mental energy and commitments. Like we said, you can't just be stoked for 12 months of the year and go out and be like, I'm going to nail everything in this first 2 weeks of training. It's going to be perfect. You have to respect those energy expenditures and how that fits into your life realistically. You can't be going 24 hours a day nonstop and expect to be able to keep that up for an entire season. So it's about planning, what can I do now? How does that fit into my life? And what am I going to need to do as I get closer to these target events?
Yeah. I think my statement is actually quite similar to yours, and I would reduce it to do what you can when you can. I think, as we hit on, it's very easy to look at what people in warm weather climates are doing when you're in a cold weather climate, or look at what people with unlimited time are doing when you have limited time, and think that's what you're supposed to be doing. And then if you're not doing it, that you're not preparing properly. And it's just clearly not true. We know that training is Sisyphean. You are always being pushed backwards. You don't just make linear progress endlessly. You you go forward, and then sometimes it rolls back down, and you've got to roll it back up. So you're always pushing back against regression, and so that process doesn't ever stop. And as you get older or more experienced, I've said many times that like progress for me as an ex-pro masters athlete is just not getting worse every year. How little regression is there is a form of progress. And I remind my experienced masters athletes of that all the time. And so what that means is, yeah, being okay with the time that you have available, doing what you can when you can, maybe looking for those extra 15 minutes or 30 minutes that appear every now and then in your schedule, and taking advantage of those when they happen. But doing what you can when you can is often the best you can do, and you do need to be happy with that. All right. Thanks, y'all. As usual, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. All of our contact info is on cyclesmart.com. We put these podcasts up on YouTube and all the places that you get podcasts, but all of the coaches are available to be hired as coaches. And so if you're looking for a coach, or you liked what you heard today and would like to hear about all the things that maybe we didn't say that we keep for the paying clients, we encourage you to become one of them and reach out if you're interested. In the meantime, we'll continue to be helpful by sharing our knowledge on these podcasts, and hopefully we'll have another one up for you soon. But thanks for listening. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Okay.